our speaker. Heather has only recently become acquainted with UU Galveston, and she is enthralled. She has volunteered for 2 Sundays this month, the first and the last, to speak. And we're borrowing from March, the theme in March, which was resistance. There's 5 Sundays, so April will have 4 to the, no wait, I've got that mixed up. It's vulnerability was March, and that's her first talk. Her second talk will be on the theme for April, which is resistance. Heather grew up in a mainstream Christian upbringing, leaning towards charismatic, and was educated within a private Christian school systems until her sophomore year in high school. And she began a secular school. The daughter of 2 singer-songwriters and musicians, Christian, country, and gospel music heavily influenced Heather's spirituality. She consistently participated in church choirs, both at the Cathedral of Hope and Unity of Arlington. At Unity, she served as the prayer chaplain, as well as for 2 years. Her desire to serve others led her to volunteer outside of church walls at Zach's Ridge for 5 years, where she learned to facilitate small groups and provide safe spaces for those who need it. It would be losing her mother to cancer when her mother was 54 that began to shake her faith. But even that test wouldn't shake her resolve to teach and share her love of Christ. At the urging of her wife, Heather became an ordained minister in 2013. Her openness to all ways of experiencing Christ continue to lead her way in life. And her talk today is, Who is Coming Beside You? Welcome, Heather.
Good morning, everybody. As a recovering charismatic, we will be out of church today. We will not be here until whenever. That's my prerequisite for the day. So, if you all would join me in prayer, with your eyes closed, with our hands outstretched, we come before you, Spirit, in all of your many various ways. As mother and father and creator, we open our arms and our heart to you, to each other, to ourselves, and we embrace this moment. And we stand together above all in unity. And as we take a breath out, we release any hindrances within ourselves. And we release any preconceptions of what you would want us to know and to embrace today. In all of your many names, amen. So, as Mary had mentioned, with the affirmation and support of my wife, I decided to become an ordained minister through Universal Life Church in 2013. Now, initially, it began with ordination to perform weddings and funerals, vow renewals. But here's the truth, the vulnerable truth. I wanted more. That wasn't enough. As a little human, because I identify as non-binary, I won't say little girl, but as a little human, I served communion. Every Sunday we had church at 10:30 with my teddy bears all lined up in rows with communion and the wafers. Did the preaching, which lasted forever, of course, like I was taught, like clockwork every Sunday. And there were very few things, even when I was little, that I was sure of, that I questioned. But this desire to connect with people, that was the one thing that's never wavered. That was the one thing that didn't change. And it just continued to grow as I got older. So my talk today is about the path of vulnerability. The definition of vulnerability is a quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. Doesn't that sound like fun? Right? Sign me up. Yeah. No, said no one ever. No. Mm-mm. But there are many types of vulnerability, and each one of us in this room have a different experience, a different perspective of how we've experienced that. We can experience that in very public aspects, as when we have seen people march in Black Lives Matter, when people march during numerous civil rights, during Stonewall, continued fights that we see now for the LGBTQ&A, women's right to vote, a women's pro-choice march, and so many more. The path of vulnerability, though, happens in everyday experiences, but on a much smaller scale. We experience that vulnerability emotionally when we dare to be our authentic selves. We speak that truth to another human being. That path to vulnerability may, or it may not, be seen, celebrated, or even recognized as your truth. The reality is they may in turn reject all of it, which means they may reject all of you. We share the path to vulnerability when we share with ourselves the questions that we have held on to for generation after generation. What was good for mom and pop, well, that's good enough for me. Or perhaps for some, it's when we dare to answer those questions like it was for me when my mother died of cancer after praying every prayer. And it contradicts everything that we thought that we knew. We share the path of vulnerability when we share our newer revelations of that truth with others. We allow ourselves the acceptance that we may be wrong just as quickly as we deem ourselves to be right. That's a tough one. We share that vulnerability when we risk living that path to vulnerability to another human being. Because the reality is we can't control the emotional outcome of another human, although I wish we could most of the time, more than we can control the winds, the weather, or natural disasters. So how do we, as spiritual beings having a human experience, how do we begin to understand that mystery? How do we move from fear to embrace the path of vulnerability? How do we see the beauty in something that scares the crap out of most of us? How do we begin that, maybe for the very first time, connect and find our ability to connect with others? I truly believe in my own experience, and maybe for some of you, that is only when we get to that point that we can go beyond the walls of hatred, discrimination, theological divisions, sexism, gender roles, just to name a few. So, in order for me, maybe for you, what is it that vulnerability is not so that we can embrace what it truly is in all of its fullness? So here's what we think of most of the time when we think of vulnerability. Vulnerability is weakness. Oh, I don't do vulnerability. I don't do that. That's not me. No, I'm good. I don't do that. Vulnerability is letting it all hang out. I'm an open book. Here's everything all at once. And that for me was my biggest challenge, learning that balance. And then the fourth one, which I think may be one of the hardest, we can go it alone. Anne Frank, 1929, 1945, a young Jewish girl, her sister and her parents moved to the Netherlands from Germany after Adolf Hitler and the Nazis came to power there in 1933 and made life increasingly difficult for Jews. In 1942, Frank and her family went into hiding in a secret apartment behind her father's business in German-occupied Amsterdam. Addressing her diary entries to an imaginary friend she called Kitty, Anne Frank wrote about life in hiding including her impressions of the other inhabitants of the secret annex, her feelings of loneliness, and her frustration over the lack of privacy. While she detailed typical teenage issues such as crushes on boys, arguments with her mother, and resentments, which were quite a bit towards her sister, Frank also displayed keen insight and maturity when she wrote about the war, humanity, and her own identity. My point in all of that is this, my beloveds, is that even when she couldn't show that vulnerability with her mother, her father, her sister, she still was determined to find a way to be vulnerable, to be strong, because vulnerability is not about being weak. She went out of her way. She was determined to find that way to be strong, to be vulnerable. She understood well above her age that her struggles, her strength, not her weakness, was not just hers, but it was all of ours. It still is all of ours. There was a universal cry to understand the oneness of her individual vulnerability, her strength, our vulnerability, our strength. I truly believe unknowingly that Anne lived this truth because she knew that this would outlive what her body could and would not. Number 2, I don't do vulnerability. But you do. I do. When we are all born, we begin the journey to another journey. It is a journey, I believe, that we come into the understanding and acceptance that we are the very definition of vulnerability. We are born into a place, an environment that we have never known before. We have never seen. Everything is new. Everyone is new. And every emotion is not known until we have experienced. We are faced with situations that we have not been in before. So in truth, you, me, we've been doing vulnerability since we took our first breath in this human experience that we call life. It is a fabric of our life that is woven in our very DNA. We can't escape it. So just for now, just today, right now, right here, perhaps we can say, I live in the understanding and the truth of what vulnerability is. I do live in balance, and I know how to flow with the Spirit. I breathe strength by embracing compassion and empathy. I am surrounded not by few, but by many, and I am not doing this by myself. I embrace vulnerability, and I celebrate that we are the very face of her, of him, of them. They are us, and we are inseparable. Vulnerability, what we think it is that we have to let everything just hang out. But I want you to think about this. Vulnerability changes. It doesn't stay stagnant. It doesn't remain the same. For example, ponder the mystery of the ocean. On any given day when you're driving down seawall, there are days that you see those waves coming in and they crash and they expand and it looks like it's just going to engulf everything around it. There's no signs of it slowing down. It's vulnerable, it's strong. And other times, you see it as the waves come in very light increments, and you look out and it looks as if you can see all the way to the very end with nothing at the end. It's just this massive nothingness, right? And then there's other times where there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing moving at all. There's no waves, there's no sound, and yet when the sun hits, it looks like it's just this crystal, the sparkling glass. But you know what? That is vulnerability. That's who comes beside us. It's always moving. It's always changing. It is strength. It is balance. It is never alone. It connects to us and we connect to it. The last quote that I have is by Eric Toll. Now that we understand what vulnerability is in its fullness, ponder this. At the deepest level, an open heart is spacious presence, in which the sense of separateness, of vulnerability between yourself and the other dissolves, and there is recognition of oneness, of shared consciousness. That recognition is love. Sensing the formless essence in another and recognizing it as one with your own essence, that's what love is. All this is an intrinsic part of the awakened consciousness and the revelation of the spiritual dimension of life. We are strong, we are balanced, we are not alone, and vulnerability is an amazing gift. Continue to share it as you have with me. God bless.